in Washington, D.C., around 7,000 people currently experiencing homelessness consider how they'll fight the cold this year. Faced with life-threatening temperatures, the best option for many is to check into a shelter.
I'm Stephen Mashesky, I'm 32. I have a job in transportation, and I'm pretty much here.
Shortly after relocating to Washington, D.C. earlier this year, Stephen found himself unemployed, so he looked for a place to stay while he got back on his feet.
I've been here since February. It took me a little while to get, proper work done so I can go back to work. Now that I have a job, I'm saving so I can get my own place and be gone.
When he first became homeless, Stephen stayed at a nearby city-run shelter. In contrast to the privately funded faith-based facility where he eventually landed, it was a typical example of what you might find in Washington, D.C. A world away in terms of cleanliness, resources, and safety, many are in constant danger of being shut down as insect bites, theft, and violence go unchecked.
A low-barrier shelter is one where you can take alcohol in, you can take drugs in, you can smoke in the facility, and that creates an environment where individuals are concerned about what goes on in the shelter.
There's rats, high drug use, high assaults. I would rather sleep outside than go over there.
And many people do. Hypothermia is an emergency that claims 700 lives every year in the United States, but many would rather risk freezing to death than face the unknown dangers that lie in a homeless shelter.
For people who say that they would rather live on the street than in the shelter, I think that at first blush people think that just sounds crazy, but there's a lot of good reasons why they stay away. I would say that by and large the shelters are too big and too decrepit and too infested and too poorly supervised. And so there is a lot of, there's a lot of theft, there's a lot of drug use, there's violence occasionally, and it's not usually violence in the shelter, it's violence around the shelter, particularly from drug dealers who prey upon homeless people.
But it's not for lack of funds. In the United States, some degrees of homelessness are indistinguishable from the most extreme forms of poverty. Overflowing warehouses are just one quick solution to the bigger, long-term problem of unaffordable housing.
And if there was more low-income housing, we wouldn't have so many people on the street in the first place, and we wouldn't have to spend as much money as we spend every year keeping people alive on the street. So I don't think it's a question of resources. It's a question of priorities.
So why not solve the problem at its root? Advocates say it's because homelessness is a reality that comes into conflict with the very idea of America and the so-called opportunities of the American dream.
The reality is that there are millions of people who are living in the type of abject poverty that we refuse to believe exists here. That's why we tell ourselves that people who are homeless choose to be homeless, or that they're all addicts, or they're all criminals, because it absolves us of the responsibility to help them. If we acknowledged the fact that most people who experience homelessness are homeless because they can't afford a place to live, then we might feel guilty enough to do something about it.
In Washington, D.C., just blocks away from packed city-run shelters and the occasional private facility, a thriving city bustles. Two worlds, separate and unequal, coexisting side by side.